Overnight, more than 100 people were arrested as Boston police tore down a pro-Palestinian encampment on Emerson's campus. Now, as you can see in this video, right here from NBC 10 Boston.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
These encampments have popped up at MIT, Harvard, and dozens of college campuses across the state and the country, all in reaction to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Most notably at Columbia University, students have been camped out en masse since last week, and classes have been moved to remote for the remainder of the semester. Now, right here in Boston, the Emerson students arrested face charges of unlawful assembly. Now, GBH reporter Tori Bedford has been covering this story. You were inside the courtroom as those arraignments were supposed to happen. We also are joined with Azusa Lippit. She's a senior reporter with the Harvard Crimson and has been covering the protests on her campus. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tori, I'm going to start with you. I mean, it seemed like over 100 students were going to be arraigned, but that didn't necessarily happen.
Well, 108 students were arrested overnight, so it was about 1:45 in the morning. In the preceding days, the college and the city had been in conversation about how to handle this encampment. You know, it's in this tiny little alleyway that is a public alleyway that connects then to an MBTA transportation building, so it's both state and city jurisdiction. They gave the students about a 10-minute warning, a dispersal warning, and then police came from both sides and cleared, you know, it was this very chaotic, violent clash, right? We know from the Boston police that 4 officers were injured, 1 seriously, non-life-threatening injuries, but some of the students were taken away in stretchers. We don't know the full extent of their injuries, but I've heard from multiple students that some have had some pretty severe injuries. So today, you know, 8 students were brought into Boston Municipal Court for arraignments, but there's actually a judge conference going on at BMC, and so those were postponed. But arraignments are going to be happening between as early as the 29th and then I think as late as May 7th. So they're kind of processing this 108 students and other protesters, not just students, who were involved in this disbursement, this sweep.
Yeah, there have been a lot of accounts on social media and other places about exactly what happened. In fact, we actually have a soundbite from a witness describing the police coming in and arresting students. So let's take a listen.
The big vans, they came in, they parked right in front of this alleyway, and the cops came out and they started arresting students, like forcing their way into the encampment and everything, pushing students to the ground. I saw one student get shoved into the pavement and then their hands forcefully pulled behind them.
Now, Tori, this encampment has been up for, well, I won't say some time, but at least a good amount of time. Yeah, a couple of days. Yeah. I imagine a lot of folks are saying they're going to go right back to their protests and to their cause.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think there's already across the city and across greater Boston, and I think connected to the larger national pro-Palestine movement, there are networks, right, where people are communicating, and I think they are hoping to return. What's tricky about Boston and about the Emerson campus, so I want to hear about how things are going at Harvard. Yeah. The Harvard campus, you know, they're on Harvard private property, right? At Emerson, you're right there in the middle of the city and you're on a public street. And so the city issued an ordinance, Mayor Michelle Wu issued an ordinance last year that banned camping, like encampments, and it was designed around homeless encampments. But I think that it was mentioned, she made comments today, and there was a statement from Emerson's president, Jay Bernhardt, that also acknowledged the violation of the city ordinance law in having these encampments out. So this is a sort of complicated issue where, you know, the police are coming in. I think just today we saw Northeastern police coming in to break up an encampment. And at Emerson, when they were coming in, you know, there were state officers there as well. They're coming in to break up an encampment both at the school but also on city property. So I don't know, you know, what kind of the future holds in terms of the encampment returning, but right now I think the focus for this movement, for the organizers, is to kind of work on getting through the arraignment process, and then, you know, their goal, which I think, you know, we've had so many conversations about these college protests,
right, exactly.
And I think they're really important. And there are, you know, the ACLU came out against the arrests in a statement today. But I think that it's also important to just remember why the students are doing this in the first place, and that they're protesting the Israeli government and their institutions' connection to other places that support the Israeli government. So they wanted transparency on the college's endowment, and they wanted divestment from any companies that work with the Israeli government, the IDF, you know, weapons manufacturing, that kind of thing.
Azusa, I'd love to talk about what's happening on Harvard, because I know many folks have been following it closely, especially since Claudine Gay called to resign, leaving that school, the conflict sort of escalating to some degree on Harvard's campus, and now the public being closed out. You know, what has been the temperature on Harvard's campus through your reporting?
Right. Thank you so much. This is definitely a developing story. I want to say I'm incredibly proud of the news staff over at the Harvard Crimson. We've been putting out time-stamped blog-style live updates ever since the encampment started yesterday, Wednesday afternoon around 12:30 p.m. And going forward, you know, 24 hours a day, though we aren't sure how long the encampment will last. Some reporters will be there on the ground out there. I will say, from what we have seen on the ground, although certainly maybe there's going to be some students who are opposed to the encampment protest, on the ground we have seen a largely very peaceful occupation of Harvard Yard. There's currently about 35 tents pitched right in front of the well-visited John Harvard statue. And there's music playing from the tents. There's programming like teach-ins about student activism and Palestine. And about 5 times a day, they have been having an opportunity for Muslim student protesters to gather and have sort of a makeshift tent for privacy in routine daily prayers.
You know, we've been talking about the importance of the student reporting on these particular issues. I know Columbia made headlines for sure about their handling, or in some cases, some people may say mishandling, of what's been happening on campus there with the freedom of speech and the upholding of that. As a student journalist yourself, when you see something like Columbia where they just sweep out the students and change their policies to sort of perhaps silence some groups or quell what's happening there on campus, what goes through your mind as someone who is also reporting on it as well?
Well, I will say, since the college restricted Harvard Yard access on Sunday to only Harvard ID holders, it has been especially critical for us to really be there at all times and be able to share with our readers timely and accurate reports of events as they've been unfolding. And we've found that to be really critical for both our Harvard readership and nationwide.
Is this dividing the campus?
You know, again, as I said, I'm sure some students may be upset about the encampment protest, but again, as we have been seeing on the ground, we're in a reading week before final exams begin, and students have largely just been passing by the encampment on foot on their way to study for those exams.
Yeah, we know finals week, very important as well. Tori, you know, we've been watching this unfold across the country, and we also know that this is not only just a civic issue or a social issue for folks. We know it's a political issue in folks in Capitol Hill weighing in on this conversation, especially in the Columbia case, and then, of course, in the testimonies of the MIT former president, or MIT president, the former president of Harvard, and the like. I mean, is there a sense that there's also the public wanting to join in on these demonstrations to sort of assert their thought or viewpoint on all of this?
I mean, I think we've seen, it's interesting that only ID holders are allowed to interact with this encampment or even go near it, right? Because Harvard Yard is usually this place that's full of tourists and people just kind of passing through, somebody having a picnic. At Emerson, you know, it was similar, very peaceful, and a lot of the faculty, you know, I spoke to faculty who were there in support of the students who had been arrested at the courthouse today. I think a lot of the faculty really stand with the students, and a number of people who were arrested are not currently students. Some are alumni, you know, some are just people from the community who are concerned and who wanted to be involved. So I do think that obviously these things are very contentious, very political, very controversial, but I do think that there are you know, in a broader sense, you know, there are people now, I've spoken to activists who've been at this kind of for a long time, this conflict is not new, and have said that there are people who have never been politically active before in their lives, have never thought to call their representatives, who are now really motivated, and they are making these calls, they're joining these movements. Like, for the first time ever, they are coming out and becoming more active because they really feel this push to do something.
I'm curious about like the national discourse around freedom of speech, especially on college campuses, where, you know, that's the place where you learn about the causes that are important to you. You express your opinions about those. You're learning about yourself in general. I imagine a lot of students and faculty and folks like that were commenting on how Columbia was trying to sort of, what some would argue, quell some of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, right, that we keep getting caught up in, and I think it's a really important one. And when we look at the history of protests on college campuses, we look at Kent State, we think about protests against Vietnam, we think about, I mean, you know, you and I, before we went on camera, were just talking about things we covered as student journalists, and I want to commend you because that is always the best source when things like this happen. Everybody has to cite the student journalists. They are on the ground. They know what's happening. They wake up for that 2 a.m. sweep. Like, they are there, right? And it's incredible, real coverage. But you're doing an amazing job. But I think, yeah, there's a history of this. And I think that it kind of ebbs and flows. But if we look at other countries as well, I mean, protests in the streets over government changes, like there are places in Europe where if they try to raise tuition by, you know, €100, people are going to be out marching in the streets, right? I think that it is, you know, it's a fundamental right. You know, it's our First Amendment right. And then it gets kind of muddied with things like ordinance laws and, you know, the colleges trying to handle the conflict, right, where there are student groups, Israeli student groups or Jewish student groups that they feel unsafe with the presence of this.
Right.
And then there are Jewish student groups that are in support of pro-Palestinian student groups. I mean, there's just such a huge conflict right now. And I think the way that colleges at large are handling this, like, it's really important to look at the decisions that they make from the perspective of these as learning institutions and not just money-making facilities, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly something we'll continue to cover. We'll be following your coverage and, of course, your coverage as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.